An Ozful dream continued. After brushing her teeth and doing her hair in a couple of pigtails, she emerged from the bathroom to get dressed. As she got ready, she could still see that Disco had not moved. She began to wonder why Disco was acting so weird. She was still sitting pretty, staring at the bookcase, but now with a slight whimper. Once Darlin was completely dressed, she decided she could go take Disco outside to do her business. When she went over to Disco, for some reason, she reached for the Wizard of Oz and tried to remove it. She was startled by the combination of the bookcase rising upward in front of her, revealing a secret passage, and the sound the fire made on the other side of the room due to the new oxygen it received from the secret passage. Turning back to the bookcase, or the secret passageway where the bookcase was, Darlin could see Disco rather curiously run into the secret passage. Disco looked back and barked for Darlin to follow her. Wow, Benson would love this. Without any hesitation, Darlin followed Disco into the tunnel. Within a few steps, she found a torch on the wall. She removed it from its black metal housing and went back into the room to light it on the fire. Upon returning with the lit torch, Darlin could now see in the tunnel. The passage was made of the same stone as the rest of the castle. She chuckled at the Harry Potter moment she was having. Where does it lead? What will she find? Where's Disco? Were all the questions racing through her mind. As she walked in, she could see the passage was very narrow and had a rounded ceiling. There were small exhaust holes with metal bars every few feet or so. It was not long before she arrived at a split in the tunnel. She called out, "Disco!" Quickly she realized when Disco barked back that she had took the passage on the right that sort of looked like stairs going up. Darlin followed. However, once she started going up, she realized that instead of stairs to walk up, there were stones spaced out every 2 feet. The small stones reminded her of indoor rock climbing nubs she had used. She had taken a weekend class with one of her oldest friends, Willow, who was only there because of a boy. Willow lived back in Hollywood, and they had been best friends their whole life. Every time Darlin visited home, she would hang with her. Darlin quickly ran up the makeshift stairs and arrived at what must have been the next floor of the castle. As she walked along the passage, she came up to what looked like a little observation station. There was a small red Indian rug with brown tassels. Bolted on the wall was one of those fold-down seats covered in red leather held on by a row of gold decorative tacks that they used to upholster really old wingback chairs. Across from the chair was a window, or what Darlin came to realize a second later when a man came into her view to clean with Windex and did not see her. Startled at first, but quickly she realized it was a two-way mirror. The man stood looking at himself on the other side. Darlin stood there and made a few faces at the man, knowing he could not see her. The man wore John Lennon spectacles and had bright orange hair that reminded you of Weasley. His hair came to a point in a frohawk. With his white lab coat on, he kind of looked like a red Q-tip. He was very tall and thin, like the purple pie man. When the orange-haired man started to pick his nose, Darlin turned away in disgust and continued down the narrow tunnel in search for Disco. After traveling for 100 feet or so, she felt secure enough to yell out, "Disco!" without having that Q-tip hear her. She called out, "Disco!" As she continued down the tunnel, it started to widen. There was a small table with 5 chairs around it. On the table was a used old deck of cards and a few beer bottles. She thought, this must have been where those little guys went to get away and drink without her grandma. Mrs. No Fun allowed breathing down their necks. Darlin began to pick up her pace as she walked through the room, continuing down the passage. The room quickly sloped back into the narrow passageway it was before it widened. She began to pick up her pace and called out, "Disco!" Standing at another fork in the road, she lowered the torch towards the floor. She thought maybe there was a way she could see any of Disco's footprints or any indication of which way she went. The slight draft from the exhaust pipes up on the ceiling of the tunnel left little or no trace of the dog. The fork in the road was a little different than the last 4. It had 3 paths. Darlin, not knowing what to do, decided to take the far left one and then work her way right. She walked down the tunnel, and after about 20 feet, she noticed that the floor had changed from stone to metal. It was a dead end. Just as she turned around, a metal gate dropped in front of her. Suddenly, she could feel the floor raise. At first, quite scared, she soon realized she was in some sort of slow-moving elevator. From her judgment, she wasn't sure how high she had risen, but it felt like a long ride. The elevator came to an abrupt stop with a loud clanking sound, scaring Darlin once again. Seconds later, the wall slid sideways, revealing another room. Relieved that she was not trapped anymore, she stepped off the elevator and into the room. Then the room itself was completely round and about 20 feet in diameter. Not needing the torch anymore, she went back onto the elevator and placed the torch in the same type of housing it was in just outside of her room. Inside the room, there was a wooden floor matched entirely by the wooden bookshelf that completely surrounded the entire room, except for a small space for a desk and a window. Not seeing any other way out, she went to climb on the desk to look outside the window. When she made it on top of the desk, she looked out the window. Outside the window, she could see the other 4 towers below. She concluded that she was in the tallest of the 5 towers. She thought to herself, even if she broke the window and screamed for help, that no one would be able to hear her. Thus, the effectiveness of a castle tower. What a breathtaking view. She looked out past the castle's outer walls. She could see fields upon fields of corn and mustard seed, which lit up the landscape in patches of golden green. When she took a step back, out of the corner of her eye, on the top of the bookshelf was an oil can. Stunned by this coincidence, at first, she took another step back, almost falling backwards off the desk. Once she acquired her footing, she quickly concluded that it was just chance, and she would be crazy for even thinking that it had something to do with her dream. Looking over to the other side, she noticed that there was rolled up blueprints. Looking past and following the entire bookshelf all the way around, her eyes came to rest on the oil can once again. And after partially unrolling of some sort of blueprint of a rocket and putting it back beside where old books on the top shelf, with old books on top of the shelf, she could see a collection of old Hudson Bay catalogs dating back to 1864. She reached her hand through a ladder and pulled out one of the books. It was a 1920s catalog. Inside, she could see that you could buy entire house packages for $2,000. Also noticing that the department store sold cars for $500. Flipping to the fashion area, she got a kick out of the clothing items only costing pennies. She climbed off the desk, still reading the catalog, and felt a pull on her long leaf skirt, stopping her from walking. She turned around to see that it had gotten caught in the top drawer, and she must have closed the drawer when she climbed down. As Darla went to pull on the door to free her skirt, she realized it was locked. Just great, she thought. Where the heck are the keys? Pulling on all the drawers frantically to find the keys, but they were locked. She began to look around the room. She placed the book down on the desk and seen a key hanging from a nail at the top of the far side of the ladder. The ladder was one of those kind that are anchored to a rail at the top of the bookshelf. It had also had another track on the floor that the ladder would circle the room. In the middle was a small round orange rug, very similar to the ladder Belle rode in Beauty and the Beast. As Darlin climbed carefully up on the ladder, she reached for the skeleton key and felt her skirt tear. Ever skid, she thought. She really loved that skirt. While still on the ladder, reached down to pull her skirt up to examine it. It wasn't that bad. It only caught the tip. Even though it was only the tip, it was enough to drive Darlin crazy. She hated frayed fabric. She got off the ladder thinking, must be a pair of scissors in the desk. It was an old desk and looked like it might be several hundred years old. It was quite decorative, with 4 drawers on either side, with a thin log drawer in the middle. She could see her skirt tip still hanging out. After dropping the key on the floor, she bent down to pick it up and noticed a keyhole below the last drawer on the right. It was a very secret spot, for she had not have bent down, she would have never seen it. Without any hesitation, she put the key in the hole and turned it. She heard a slight mechanical sound followed by a loud knock. Not too curious at first, she tried to open the bottom drawer. It was locked. Still, she tried a few more drawers and thought, how junk. I guess now is as good a time as any to explain what I mean when Darlin uses the slang junk. For it's been in the story a few times, and you might not know what it means. It goes way back to when she was 5 years old, before she was shipped off to private school full time. Her parents' lifestyle included swearing, so unfortunately, she learned the meaning of bad words at a very young age. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't as if they swore at her or even in front of her. Well, maybe sometimes, but for the most part, they thought they were being clever by using code for swearing, where they always only said the first letter of any bad words. For example, why did you buy me this piece of J, which was code for piece of junk? Well, perhaps it was Darlene needed to show her parents that she had cracked the code, or she was said it was just to show off in front of company. The story goes that at dinner party, her parents were hosting. Darlene said out loud for all to hear, "Do I have to eat this pea of junk?" Everybody laughed, and she noticed that she did not get in trouble for saying what she thought at the time was a bad word. Darlene was real young back then and would normally get in trouble if she said a bad word like junk or crap. Her being smart enough to catch that people would not get as angry or even might laugh if she said it her way. Over time, P of junk evolved to P junk. Thus, the birth of Darlene saying P junk. Now, getting back to the story. Darlene tried to open the middle drawer. It did not open, but she could see another keyhole below the handle. At first thinking, how many keyholes does this stupid desk have? Then how this thing really was P junk. She bent down to grab the skeleton key out of the keyhole, and to her surprise, this was very hard to do. She turned the key to the right, and it felt like there was some resistance. When the key made it to the center of the lock, she heard a click, followed by a knocking around. She then was able to remove the key and unlock the top keyhole. Pulling open the top drawer to look for scissors, she grabbed her tip of torn fabric. The drawer was lined with thin dark green velvet and only contained a couple of bottles of ink and a fountain pen. Continuing to go through all the drawers, she did not find any scissors, just junk. When she came to the last drawer, it felt rather heavy to pull out, but it was empty, except for the dark green lining and an old envelope full of stamps. When she went to reclose the drawer, she seen the first keyhole again and decided to see what was within this drawer. She removed the key from the middle drawer and put it back in the first keyhole and turned. She could hear the sound of gears moving, followed by a knock. When Darlene opened the drawer the second time, she seen that the drawer was now lined with red velvet and contained a stack of very old papers stained yellow with time. Sorry about that. The papers were bound with red ribbon. This was a hidden drawer. Once Darlene picked up the bundle of papers, she read on the front page, "The Witches of Oz." Darlene's jaw dropped. She brought her hand up to the side of her face and began to rub the sides of her temples. Unaware this was a common reaction for her in stressful situations. She continued to read, 1864. Out of curiosity, she untied the ribbon bundle, which was now on the desk. She flipped the first page over. She began to read. It read, Dorothy lived in the midst of the great Kansas prairies with Uncle Henry, who was a farmer, and Auntie Em. Darlene turned a chapter in or so. Did you groan? Asked Dorothy. Yes, I've been groaning for more than a year, and no one has ever heard me before or come to help me, answered the Tin Man. What can I do for you? She asked, for she was moved by the sad voice in which the man spoke. Just get the oil can and oil my joints, the Tin Man said. Darlene shook her head and came to the conclusion that this was an original handwritten version, The Wizard of Oz. She had it read to her by her grade 3 teacher, Mrs. Northington. Now flipping to the last page, she read the final words of the book. From the land of Oz, Dorothy gravely, and here is Toto too, and oh, Annie M. I'm so glad to be home again. The end. Down at the bottom of the page, it read, written by with an X blank, but with no signature. Stunned at her find, She sat there in amazement, reading the last sentence again. By the time she came to the part, "Here is Toto too," Darling remembered Disco. She quickly put the stack of papers back together and tied the ribbon in a bow and placed it back in the bottom drawer. She closed the drawer, turned the key, until she heard a click. After putting all the drawers shut and making sure everything was in order, she locked the top lock on the middle drawer. She hooked the key back up on the ladder and turned to leave, only to notice that the entranceway to the elevator was gone. She was trapped. Collapsing to the floor in the middle of the room on the orange small rug, she sat in defeat. Almost as instantly as she sat down, she sprung up in a spinning motion and thought, "Hey, one of these books is going to open the secret passage." She started to go around the bottom 2 shelves pulling on books. At first, just randomly, but when nothing happened, she thought that she should do this methodically. One book at a time, book by book. After doing the entire 4 shelves, and an hour's time went by, Darling was getting very stressed. She thought of giving up and breaking the window and yelling out whether or not they could hear her. She then thought of the trouble she might get in and gave her the courage to keep on looking. The room was almost done. She rode the ladder all the way around the room, checking the top row of books. She only had about 3 more books to go when she spotted a pair of scissors hanging on a nail. She reached through the ladder and grabbed the scissors. She turned with her back leaning against the ladder and pulled up the tip of her skirt and cut the tip into a point again. When she turned around, the first thing she seen was the oil can. She picked it up and got off the ladder. This was really some coincidence. She had been dreaming of the Wizard of Oz in class. She then had another dream about an oil can that was now in her hands. She then found a handwritten copy of the Wizard of Oz, after pulling on the Wizard of Oz book that revealed a secret passage in a castle. She was either going nuts or somehow her recent studies of the Wiccan ways have given her some sort of foresight. She placed the oil can down on the carpet and went back up to check on the few books. The last book was another copy of The Wizard of Oz. She thought, no way, as if, why didn't she think to look for it before? She pulled out the book and the ladder stairs gave way, turning into a makeshift slide. She slid down the ladder on her belly, screaming. At first, thinking the ladder had broke. Then realizing that she was in fact sliding down past the floor into a dark tunnel. She was moving very fast, descending down some sort of slide. Still screaming, Darling now turned onto her back and continued sliding down what seemed to be forever. The dark slide still echoing with her screams. Darling could see a light, and she flew out of the slide into a somersault and landing in the end of a bed. On her back, with her feet just off the end of a bed, looking straight up at black silk draped over a canopy. As Darling sat up and turned around, she realized by the decor of the room that this was her grandma's bedroom. Sorry. It had the same dreary look as her black dress she had always wore. Looking behind her, above the head of board, she could see a painting slowly lowering itself, hiding the tunnel she had just slid out from. Within seconds, the passage was completely gone. Darling found the painting very peculiar. It was of 4 young girls that were all dressed as witches. They were on a stage in front of a crowd of people. Darling was reminded of graduation. 3 of the girls that looked identical were standing, pointing, and appeared to be laughing at the other girl, who was at a podium, speaking to a crowd. When she looked closer, Darling seen the lone girl at the podium, Kate, was smoking. Darling shook her head at the thought of how odd the painting was. Like Benson had said yesterday, the richer you are, the more eccentric you get. The room was the shape of a giant rhombus, and Darling was standing right in the middle of it. Rhombus, sorry, not a rhombus. It was the shape of a giant rhombus, and Darling was standing right in the middle of it. The bed was covered in a dark gray blanket with one silk black pillow. Darling quickly straightened out the blanket and noticed that the oil can had fell down the slide with her. She picked it up. Hopefully she would be able to get out of this without getting in trouble. Once satisfied that the bed looked like she was never on it, she began to look for an exit. The last thing she wanted to do was have to explain why or how she was there in the first place. Looking around the room for an exit, she could see that her grandma's room was real cold and borderline creepy. It lacked any sense of style. The bed itself had 4 big posters made of dark brown walnut. Each poster was carved to look like it had hand-large thistles reaching out of wooden vines wrapped around them. 6 feet high at the top of each poster was a wooden fist in which a black silk she was staring at early was passing through. The walls of the room were lined with the same dark walnut wood paneling as the bed. As Darlin made it over to check what looked to be the main door, she could see all the walls were made up of many different drawers and cubbies. The big log doors met at a point at the top. Almost as soon as she put her ear to the door, she heard a voice. It was her grandma's voice, and it was getting louder. She quickly sprinted deep into the room and hid between a massive mirror and a closet behind some sort of black curtain. Across from the bed, standing straight up with her face towards the wall, she waited and listened. What was she going to say to her grandma? Was already an old lady before she had her privacy invaded. She could think of nothing except to just try and not be found. She was trying to make sure she was hiding very good by making herself as small as she could when she heard the door creak open and someone walked in the room. I will take my steam bath later. There is no time. We have to get out back and some guests have already arrived, spoke Darlin's grandmother. She was speaking rather loudly, as if to someone that was in the next room. Darlin could feel a slight breeze as her grandma sped by. She felt a little relief to know that her grandma passed her and she had still gone undetected. Still very aware that she might get caught, she quieted her breathing. Darlin could hear her grandma fumbling around, going through different drawers as if looking for something. After a few minutes of this torture, she had just had to take a peek. Carefully, she slid the curtain slowly until she could see her grandmother's reflection in the mirror. She was up on a stepladder reaching for a box. Darlin could see her huge petticoat up in the air. Looking down at her feet, Darlin could not believe her eyes. That bitch, after all that nagging and questioning last night, she too was wearing ruby slippers. Except those were not heels like hers, more like slippers. When she seen her grandmother begin to step down, she immediately reclused back into the shadows of the black curtain and slid tight into the corner to be undetected. She could hear her walk up and stop right beside her, holding her breath ever so tightly. The only thing Darlin could hear was her grandmother's wheezy breath just inches away from her. This was it. What was she going to say that is if she doesn't have a heart attack and die from Darlin's intrusion? Darlin stood there holding her breath, waiting for the inevitable. She felt a swift breeze and heard her grandmother leave the room. She had done it. She went undetected and was in the clear. Not a second went by after she heard the door close. Darlin jumped out from behind the black curtain. She started to straighten it out, hoping to remain undetected, when she realized that it wasn't a black curtain at all, but a long black cape accompanied by a witch's hat. This was all getting way too weird. There were way too many coincidences here. The dreams, the books, her heels, Grandma's ruby slippers, and now a witch's hat. There was something going on. Perhaps it was something she had done, unknowingly, through messing with that Wiccan book. Maybe it was one big dream. She wished for a moment to wake up, but the realness of her surroundings crushed all hopes of that. There was no time to waste. She had to get out of there. On the other side of the room, she had seen another door just past the stepladder her grandmother was standing on. Darlin ran over and opened the door. It was a bathroom. She closed the door and turned back towards the big doors to hear if her grandmother had left the next room. After listening at the door and hearing voices, she went back by the mirror in case her grandmother came back. This time, as Darlin ran for the cover of the witch's cloak, she had seen on the bookcase next to the mirror the same copy of The Wizard of Oz that had revealed the 2 last secret passages on it. Stopping instantly, she decided to see if it worked. The moment she pulled the book back, the mirror began to rise. She seen her reflection began to disappear as the mirror rose up. Darlin took note of how stupid she looked holding that oil can. She should have never picked it up in the first place. As soon as the mirror rose high enough for her to get under, she darted into the tunnel. The only light available was that from the room she had just left. As she ran through the passage, it darkened the further she went in. While running, she wondered if it wasn't for her silly dream that Benson had told her about, she would have never picked up the damned oil can. Now she would have to risk going back up into the tower to put it back. So when the path opened up, Darlin realized that she reached the area with the 3 paths she had been in earlier. When she went up into the tower, the mirror from her grandma's room slid down slowly. The path turned pitch dark. Darlin stood there for a moment, upset that she did not have the torch. She knew it was too far to go all the way back to her suite in the dark, plus she hadn't found Disco. A little worried, she called out, "Disco!" To her amazement, she heard her bark. It was coming from the 3rd passage she had not taken. She very cautiously started to make her way down the passage where Disco was. Darlin could feel a buildup of dirt on her hands from having to keep on the passage walls to balance and keep her footings. "Oh, great. Now I have to get a manicure, Disco," she called out. She could hear Disco's barks get louder and louder. She knelt down in the pitch black. She could hear Disco running towards her. She put her hands low to the ground, but the first thing she felt from Disco was a lick inside her mouth. Normally, Darlin loves kisses from Disco, but not near her mouth. She spit out a few times. "Oh, Disco, where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." The 2 of them stood in the dark, thankful to finally found each other. It wasn't as if Disco had never gone missing before, but this was the first time Darlin was ever truly worried about her. After a few minutes of cuddling, Disco barked twice, then ran down the path in which she had came. "Disco, Disco, come back here right now," Darlin cried out, only to hear Disco barks even further away. In the pitch black, Darlin stood up, using the wall as a guide, and followed after her. Darlin could feel the moisture in the stone walls as her fingers brushed along the walls, and soon the path started to curve as she could see a light orange glow in the distance. When she made it close enough, she could see Disco at the end of the path barking for her. "What have you there?" She knelt down beside little Disco to investigate. The orange glow was coming from a room on the other side of what looked to be another 2-way mirror. She put her face up against it to peer in, but could not see anything but the orange glow. The room appeared to be full of smoke or steam. She quickly looked around to see how to open the would-be exit. After a few minutes of feeling around, she could not find any way to open it. Disco was up on her 2 feet looking into a hole just a bit larger than a person's arm. There were 2 holes, one on top of each other, on the left side of the glass door. "Do you think it's in there?" she asked the dog, as if she would answer. Darlin reached inside the hole. There was nothing. She went down to the hole that Disco was at, and it had nothing. Maybe she had to reach in deeper. She put her arm in all the way up to her bicep. She got an eerie feeling, like what if there's a bug, and pulled her arm out. Getting down on her knees, Darlin tried to look in the lower hole, but could see nothing. She had to try. Darlin put her arm back in and reached as far back as she could. There was a button. When she pressed the button, it closed in around her arm. She was trapped. She was starting to panic for a bit, realizing that it would not help the situation. She stopped and tried to carefully work her arm free. It was locked. It must have been a security feature to stop someone from entering. What had she got herself into now? She started to think that this day was going to be the death of her. Then she had an idea. "Disco, you're going to have to go for help. I'm stuck. Go get Benson," said Darlin to Disco. Disco looked at her almost as if she understood, then jumped into the lower hole. "Disco, no, you're going to get stuck," panicked Darlin as she tried to grab Disco's tail. But it was too late. The dog went deeper into the hole. A few seconds later, Darlin felt her arm let free as she pulled out, just as the glass door started to slide up. As soon as the glass rose high enough, smoke started to pour out of the room. Darlin reached into the hole that Disco was in and pulled her gently out by the tail. When the smoke cleared, Disco could see that the orange glow coming from the room was that of a fire burning under what appeared to be a cauldron. Looking past it, she could see that the room was round and made of gold brick. With Disco in her arms, she took a step in. Now she could see that the entire room, from the grout between the bricks, was some sort of roots that were spread across the brick like some sort of designer lace. She walked over to the cauldron and looked inside to see what was boiling away. This is a witch's cauldron. Is Grandma really a witch? She thought to herself, staring at the purple liquid boiling away in the cauldron. She watched purple bubbles form into white stars, then evaporated into steam. Daring not to touch it, she walked away towards an old wooden makeshift science table that seemed to defy gravity. It was littered with all sorts of test tubes. When Darlin made it to the table, she could see the test tubes that were stacked like something the Cat in the Hat would do, filled with green, red, and blue liquids that were accumulating in a large teardrop bowl that was swirling color combination of all three colors. Looking into the bowl, she could see her own reflection, all distorted. The condensation was gathering underneath the teardrop bowl and dripping into an old wooden bowl. Every time a drop splashed into the bowl, Gurlet would fizz up and form a miniature twister. I'm not sure what that word is. Oh my God, she gasped. Darlin had seen a lot in her day, but nothing could compare to this. One time in science class, she seen a girl named Lily burn her eyebrows off and permanently give her hair one of those pure white stripes. The teacher said it was due to extreme fear. Darlin tried to figure out how this stack of test tubes was actually staying up by walking around the table. When she arrived at the other side, she seen a very old leather book. It had metal bindings and was a faded green leather. Rubbing her hand over the raised printing, she could tell that it had used to have a large S that had been worn down with too much use. The side had a lock, but it was undone. She opened the book, and it made some sort of cackling sound. Darlin jumped back, dropping it closed again. After building up the nerve, she lifted it open again. Hee 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 hee. It cackled again. This time, when she stepped back, she gave it an extra push so that it would fall open. This time, taking a couple of steps back, she bumped into some sort of rat, causing clutter to fall behind her. Disco began to bark frantically as an array of brooms and Swiffer fell, scaring her to the other side of the room. Darlin turned to see what had fallen and began to pick them up. Okay, we're going to take a break.